Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be reading a book that I've only read part of. It's called Refuge Recovery, and I actually stopped because the author ended up being somebody who was using his position of power, using his addiction centers as a way to access people, access women. So, with that caveat, I'm going to continue to read this, but don't take his words, take what the Dharma has to offer, take what the lesson is, and compost the rest. This was written by a very fallible human. With that said, let's begin with the book. This is Refuge Recovery, a Buddhist Path to Recovering from Addiction, written by Noah Levine, read by Sen Kirst-Schultz. We'll begin with the introduction, which is fairly short, and then continue into the first chapter. Refuge recovery is a practice, a process, a set of tools, a treatment, and a path to healing addiction and the suffering caused by addiction. The main inspiration and guiding philosophy for the Refuge Recovery program are the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, a man who lived in India 2,500 years ago. Sid was a radical psychologist and a spiritual revolutionary. Through his own efforts and practices, he came to understand why human beings experience and cause so much suffering. He referred to the root cause of suffering as, quote, uncontrollable thirst or repetitive craving, unquote. This, quote-unquote, thirst tends to arise in relation to pleasure, but it may also arise as a craving for unpleasant experiences to go away, or as an addiction to people, places, things, or experiences. This is the same thirst of the alcoholic, the same craving as the addict, and the same attachment as the codependent. Eventually, Sid came to understand and experience a way of living that ended all forms of suffering. He did this through a practice and process that includes meditation, wise actions, and compassion. After freeing himself from the suffering caused by craving, he spent the rest of his life teaching others how to live a life of well-being and freedom, a life free from suffering. Sid became known as the Buddha, and his teachings became known as Buddhism. The Refuge Recovery Program has adapted the core teachings of the Buddha as a treatment of addiction. Buddhism recognizes a non-theistic approach to spiritual practice. The Refuge Recovery Program of recovery does not ask anyone to believe anything, only to trust the process and do the hard work of recovery. This book contains a systematic approach to treating and recovering from all forms of addictions. Using the traditional formulation, the program of recovery consists of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. When sincerely practiced, the program will ensure a full recovery from addiction and a lifelong sense of well-being and happiness. Of course, like every path, you can only get to your destination by moving forward, one foot in front of the other. The path is gradual and comprehensive, a map of the inner terrain that must be traversed in the process of recovery. The path includes daily meditation practices, written investigations of the causes and conditions of your addictions, and how to find or create the community you will need in order to heal and awaken. We have also included stories of people who have successfully recovered with the help of Buddhist practices. Although I am credited with writing the book, the large community at Refuge Recovery is the inspirational and creative force behind it. This community has helped shape, inform, and enhance the program with their direct experience of practicing these principles. This book, then, should be viewed as a collaborative effort, a book written for the plural rather than the singular, the quote-unquote we instead of the quote-unquote I, since it speaks for Buddhists and addicts everywhere. Lastly, we are aware that more will be revealed. It is our hope that we have offered here a substantial and useful foundation to the Buddhist recovery movement. We have every intention to learn and grow and revise as we go. This is just the first edition. Enjoy. The process. Refuge recovery follows the traditional Buddhist system of the Four Noble Truths, which begin with 4 actions. First, we take stock of all the suffering we have experienced and caused as addicts. Second, we investigate the causes and conditions that lead to addiction and begin the process of letting go. Third, we come to understand that recovery is possible and take refuge in the path that leads to the end of addiction. And fourth, we engage in the process of the Eightfold Path that leads to recovery. 1. Understanding. 2. Intention. 3. Communication and community. 4. Action and engagement. 5. Livelihood and service. 6. Effort and energy. 7. Mindfulness meditations. And 8. Concentration and meditations. The core philosophy of refuge recovery is based on renunciation and abstinence. We believe that the recovery process truly begins when renunciation is established and maintained. We also understand that imperfection and humility are part of the process. Even when we refrain from the primary drug or behavior, addiction at times manifests in other behaviors. We are not holding perfection as the standard, but as the goal. We believe in the human ability and potential for complete renunciation of behaviors that cause harm. We understand that for many, this is an ongoing process of establishing and/or re-establishing renunciation. Renunciation alone is not recovery, however. It is only the beginning. Those who maintain abstinence but fail to examine the underlying causes and conditions are not on the path to recovery. They are simply stopping the surface manifestations of addiction, which will inevitably resurface in other ways. The 8 factors, or folds, of the path are to be developed, experienced, and penetrated. This is not a linear path. It does not have to be taken in order. In fact, all the factors need to be developed and applied simultaneously. And to truly break free from addiction, the 8 folds of recovery must be constantly maintained. Although the process and sequence of recovery will vary from person to person, the following is an overview of how the refuge recovery approach may be applied. We begin by accepting all the ways that addiction has caused suffering in our lives and the lives of others. Turning inward and acknowledging our suffering is the beginning of the process, but also it is an ongoing practice. On a daily basis, we practice mindfulness of suffering, its causes, and its cessation. Next, we investigate the underlying conditions that have influenced, exacerbated, and perpetuated our addictions. Through reading, listening, studying, and practicing the principles of the Four Truths, which includes the Eightfold Path, we come to understand the possibility and potential of our own recovery. Having some inkling of hope and willingness, we take refuge in the potential of our own recovery, Buddha, the Four Truths and the Eightfold Path of recovery, Dharma, and in the community of fellow recovering addicts, Sangha. We embark on the practice of the Eightfold Path. We encourage you to begin with the practice of meditation right away. Meditation is going to be the most important tool in supporting our renunciation. Begin with the practice of focusing your breath. After a week, you will alternate forgiveness practice, explained in Chapter 5, with breath practice every other day. Eventually, we will want you to learn and practice all the meditations offered, but we encourage you to first develop the meditations that increase concentration. As your skill in concentration increases, we begin practicing the 4 foundations of mindfulness and the heart practices of loving kindness, compassion, appreciation, and equanimity. Next, we refine understanding, intentions, and livelihood. This is a gradual path. No one changes overnight, but we all must continue to practice, study, and act wisely to find the freedom from addiction we seek. We engage in the relational aspect of forgiveness, making amends to all people we have hurt through our addictions, words, and actions. Compassionate action is an integral aspect of the path. We encourage you to find ways to be of service, to be generous, and to be kind. Once you maintain renunciation for over a year, establish a regular meditation practice and complete the inventories, you are ready to become a mentor for newer members. We will maintain daily meditation practices and relationships with the community of recovering people. Part 1. The Four Truths of Recovery. Chapter 1. Addiction creates suffering. The path of refuge recovery begins with the first truth. Addiction creates suffering. This is not a philosophy. It is a practice. It demands action. We must understand, acknowledge, admit, and accept all the ways addiction has caused suffering in our lives. We take this action by writing and sharing an in-depth and detailed inventory of the suffering we have experienced in association with our addictions. You are probably already painfully aware of how addiction leads to suffering. Addiction to drugs, alcohol, sex, people, gambling, money, food, or whatever. The addiction creates an almost unbearable amount of suffering, confusion, and harm in the life of the addict, and the lives of the people who love the addict. What usually starts as a search for happiness and pleasure almost always ends in tremendous sorrow, loss, confusion, and suffering. Very often it leads us to suicidal thoughts, despondency, and shame. For the addict in the midst of addiction, life is often a downward spiral that ends in incarceration, institutionalization, violence, loss, and death. Some may continue to function in seemingly normal ways, working, parenting, and participating in society, but an internal death occurs, a numbness arises, and they start to disconnect from themselves and from others. A wall of denial and suppression, too high and too thick to scale or break through, keeps others out and keeps the addict in, trapped by his or her own defenses, prisoner to his or her addictions. To start the process of healing and recovery from addiction, the first thing we must do is accept how our addictions cause suffering in us and in the ones we love. We begin by understanding that addiction always creates suffering. Suffering is greed, hatred, and delusion. For the addict, it may manifest as suffering is the stress created by craving for more. Suffering is never having enough to feel satisfied. Suffering is stealing to support your addiction. Suffering is lying to hide your addiction. Suffering is feeling ashamed of one's actions. Suffering is feeling unworthy. Suffering is living in fear of the consequences of one's actions. Suffering is the feelings of anger and resentment. Suffering is hurting other people. Suffering is hurting yourself. Suffering is the feeling of being isolated and alone. Suffering is the feeling of hatred towards oneself or others. Suffering is jealousy and envy. Suffering is feeling less than, inferior, or beneath others. Suffering is feeling superior, better than, or above others. Suffering is greedy, needy, and selfish. Suffering is the thought that I cannot be happy until I get. Suffering is the anguish and misery of being addicted. All these feelings are unnecessary suffering caused by an imbalance between our instinctual drive for happiness and our instinctual need for survival. It is also very important to remember that the end of suffering does not mean the end of pain or difficulties. just the end of creating unnecessary suffering in our lives. Once we understand this, we can begin to determine whether or not we have crossed the line into addiction by looking at all the ways that our drug use, drinking, eating, gambling, sex, or relationships have become a source of suffering. This is a process that cannot be skipped or half-assed. The foundation of our recovery is a complete admission and acceptance of the suffering we have caused and experienced due to addiction. We must do away with any shred of denial, minimization, justification, or rationalization. To recover, we must completely and totally understand and accept the truth that addiction creates suffering. As addicts, we have crossed a line we can rarely cross back over. Drug addicts and alcoholics almost never regain the ability to drink or use drugs in a non-addictive way. We have to accept that abstinence is our only hope. For those who have become addicted to food or certain unhealthy behaviors related to food, however, total abstinence is not an option. Recovery entails abstaining from the addictive behaviors associated with eating to find a balanced relationship to food. There's a small percentage of former addicts who, after a period of abstinence and recovery, seem to be able to return to drinking or drugs without losing control. But this is a rare exception. The vast majority of addicts will return to active addiction if they participate in the behaviors or substances that they became addicted to in the past. Accepting that we are addicts is also accepting that we can no longer drink or use drugs. When we bring awareness to the addiction and all the suffering it has caused, we begin a process of recovery that will always include abstinence. In the beginning, it can be hard to imagine our lives without the drugs or behaviors that bring us temporary relief from the difficulties in our lives. But later, after we have firmly established the recovery practices, it will be hard to imagine a life that included addiction. The meditation, ethical behavior, and community involvement that accompany the Buddhist path to recovery will lead to an experience of such contentment and well-being that there will no longer even be an attraction to escaping or creating a false, temporary intoxication. The practice of these principles, which begins with accepting the reality of our addiction, will bring us to an enlightened state, an experience of wisdom and compassion, and forgiveness and love for ourselves and everyone else. When we experience this healing, the drive to escape and or control our experience will be replaced by a deep appreciation of life as it is. As compassion grows in our hearts, pain will no longer be so scary or something to escape from. Instead, it will turn into just another sensation or emotion to feel and to meet with kindness. We will once again be able to enjoy the life that we live with the normal joys and sorrows that come with birth and death. First Truth Inventory. Write an in-depth and detailed inventory of the suffering you have experienced in association with your addictions. Share the inventory with a trusted friend, a mentor, or your Buddhist teacher to understand the nature of your addiction/suffering. On the path of recovery, we must understand that addiction is suffering and accept all the ways that it has caused suffering in our lives. Only then can we begin to find freedom from addiction. Without full acceptance and disclosure, recovery is not possible. We cannot skip this step. We must be thorough in our inventory process. This inventory is designed to help the addict acknowledge and accept all the ways that he or she has caused and experienced suffering. It is through the process of understanding, acknowledging, and admitting suffering that we can begin to transform our relationship with suffering and begin to find liberation from it. Answer each question in depth and detail. It is best to use a notebook dedicated solely for this process. This inventory is also available in worksheet format at www.refugerecovery.org. Reader's note, just a heads up, there's going to be a lot of questions ahead that ask you to look at some stuff that's not super fun, so make sure that you're grounded, you have a space you feel comfortable in and safe in to journal on these things before you dive in. Suffering is the stress created by craving for more. List the stress your addiction has created. How did it manifest day to day, moment to moment? Suffering is never having enough to feel satisfied. How did you suffer from dissatisfaction? Suffering is stealing to support your addiction. Did you steal? From whom? Make a thorough inventory of your theft. Suffering is lying to hide your addiction. When did you start lying about your addiction? Was it blatant? Did you minimize your addiction or omit any details? Whom have you lied to, and what is the extent of your dishonesty? Suffering is feeling ashamed of one's actions. List all the ways you have felt ashamed or guilty about your actions. Suffering is feeling unworthy. Has unworthiness affected you? In what ways? Suffering is living in fear of the consequences of one's actions. Did fear of getting caught affect your life? How? Suffering is the feelings of anger and resentment. Make a detailed list of everyone whom you have ever been angry or resentful toward and why. Suffering is hurting other people. Make a list of all the people you have hurt and how you hurt them. Suffering is hurting yourself. List all the ways you hurt yourself. Suffering is the feeling of being isolated and alone. Did your addiction lead to a feeling of isolation? At the end, were you all alone in your self-created disconnection? Write about how that felt. Suffering is the feeling of hatred toward oneself. List all the things about yourself you have ever judged or hated. Suffering is jealousy and envy. Make a list of everyone and everything you have ever envied. Suffering is feeling less than, inferior to, or beneath others. List the ways you have felt less than. Suffering is feeling superior, better than, or above others. List the ways you have felt superior. Suffering is greedy, needy, and selfish. List how being greedy, needy, and selfish has affected your life and relationships. Suffering is the thought that I cannot be happy until I get. What are some of the things you think you need to be happy? Suffering is the anguish and misery of being addicted. What other forms of misery did your addiction create? How did it affect your sexuality, your finances, your looks? Suffering is greed, hatred, and delusion in all its many manifestations. How else have you suffered? List the ways you put yourself or someone else in physical danger because of your addiction. List any grief or trauma in your life that has fueled your addiction. How have you suffered physically? List any other emotional suffering you have experienced as a result of addiction. List the things that have disappeared from your life due to your addiction. List any misfortunes you have experienced because of your addiction. List any missed opportunities or failures in your life that were due to your addiction. List the ways in which your addiction has made your life different from the way you want it or intended it to be. Look at your relationship history and consider how your addiction may have caused harm in your relationships. Name some of the people and the ways that you hurt them. How has your addiction affected your sex life? Has your sexual conduct hurt others? Name the people and be specific about how you caused harm. Are there any other ways that you have experienced or caused suffering in relation to your addiction? List them here. Don't leave anything out. What would your life look like if you were free from the suffering that addiction has caused? Be specific. Allow yourself to be generous and hopeful. Where do you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? This has been Chapter 1, Addiction Creates Suffering, and the introduction of Refuge Recovery, a Buddhist path to recovering from addiction, written by and read by Sen Kirst-Schultz. Thanks for reading along with me.